The bell on the nightstand did not ring at 5:30 so much as it announced itself, a small brass certainty in the dark, and Grace Pruitt had it silenced under her palm before its second full turn, the way she had trained herself to do across 3 winters of boarding at Mrs. Averill's, so as not to trouble the rest of the house a minute before necessary. She lay a moment in the gray dark, listening to the house settle the way it always settled at this hour, a board somewhere below easing itself against the cold, the wind working at the corner of the eaves with the particular thin whistle it only made when it came out of the north. Her room was small and plain and entirely her own, which, after 3 winters, she still counted among her better fortunes. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window that looked down Elm Street toward the square, where the telephone exchange occupied the whole second floor above Danner's Dry Goods, its dark windows waiting for her the way they waited every morning. She rose, and the floor was cold enough to make her hiss softly through her teeth, and she dressed quickly by the gray window light. A shirt-waist of plain white lawn, a dark skirt brushed the night before and hung ready on its hook. Stockings pulled on sitting on the edge of the bed the way she'd learned to do to shorten the business of being half-dressed in a cold room. She built her hair up in front of the small mirror with quick, unthinking hands, the same coil she had worn to work every day since the exchange first hired her, because a girl who wished to keep her position did not experiment with her hair on a Tuesday. Downstairs, Mrs. Averill was already at the stove, a small brisk widow with silver hair pinned close and hands that moved through a kitchen with the sureness of 40 years' practice, and the smell of coffee and frying mush filled the low room before Grace had properly reached the bottom stair. "Cold enough to crack a stone this morning," Mrs. Averill said by way of greeting, setting a plate down at Grace's place at the small table. "You'll want the wool gloves, not the cotton ones." "I know it. I heard the wind arguing with the shutters half the night." "That wind argues with everybody's shutters, mine included." Mrs. Averill poured coffee, strong and pale with cream, and sat across with her own cup, which was the whole of her breakfast most mornings, claiming an old woman needed less fueling than a girl who spent her whole day on her feet, or in Grace's case, in a chair with her ears working harder than the rest of her put together. Grace ate quickly, but without hurry. Eggs, a slice of the good bread, the last of a jar of peach preserves Mrs. Averill had put up in September, and between bites went over the day's shape in her mind the way she did every morning. Which lines wanted extra patience, Mrs. Colby on the party line being who she was, and whether young Del Harmon would ring again today asking to be put through to the Whitfield residence, and specifically to Miss Iris Whitfield, a connection Grace had begun making with a private professional smile she was careful never to let into her voice. By 6:20, she had her coat and her wool gloves and was out into the gray morning, her breath showing white ahead of her down the length of Elm Street, the town still mostly dark, but for a lamp lit here and there in an early kitchen window, and the walk to the square took her the same 11 minutes it always took, past the Lutheran church with its bell not yet rung, past the feed store with its shutters still up, until she reached the narrow stair beside Danner's that led up to the exchange. The switchboard room was warm before she'd even properly entered it, a small stove in the corner already fed and drawing by old Mr. Purdy, who worked the overnight shift and had exactly 9 minutes remaining of it when Grace came through the door, stamping the cold from her boots. "Quiet night," he said, rising from the chair and stretching a back that had been folded into it since 10 the evening before. 2 calls after midnight. One was Doc Enright confirming his rounds for the morning, and one was a fellow in the next county who dialed wrong and apologized about it 3 separate times before he let me go. Some men can't seem to hang up a receiver without apologizing to it first. Some men can't do much of anything without apologizing to it first. Purdy took his coat from the peg and paused at the door, the way he always paused, the way of a man handing over something he took a quiet pride in. "Board's yours." Grace settled into the chair, still faintly warm from him, and looked out over the switchboard the way she looked out over it every morning, a long panel of small brass jacks, each one marking a household or a business in the district, and above them a row of little metal flaps that would drop and show white the instant someone lifted a receiver and turned the crank on their own end. It was, she had thought more than once, rather like being given charge of 100 small windows all at once, none of them lit yet, waiting to see which ones the day would open. The first flap dropped at 7 exactly, as it did most mornings, and Grace slid the cord into the jack and pressed the key. "Number, please." "Morning, Grace. Give me the grocer, would you?" Mrs. Fenn's voice, unmistakable, already halfway into her day's list before the connection was even properly made. "One moment, Mrs. Fenn." Grace found the grocer's jack, plugged the second cord home, and rang it through, and within 3 seconds had the small satisfaction, private, unremarked, hers alone, of 2 households joined by nothing more than her own quick hands and a length of waxed cord. Mrs. Fenn already reciting a list of flour and coffee and a dozen eggs to a grocer 40 feet down her own street, when the walk between them would have taken her 4 minutes on foot. The morning went that way, one small bridge after another. The Colby line lit twice before 8, both times Mrs. Colby ringing her sister 2 farms over to relay a piece of news that could easily have waited for church, and Grace connected them both times without comment, because an operator who let her opinion of a call show in her voice did not stay an operator very long. The bank rang through to the county seat on a matter of some transferred funds. The cashier's voice clipped and businesslike. A boy, not Del Harmon yet, that would come nearer noon, as it generally did, rang for the doctor's office to say his mother wanted a bottle of the tonic refilled, an errand passed along by wire rather than on foot. Grace connected it, noted nothing more than she'd note the weather, and moved on to the next flap, already dropping 3 jacks down. She had her dinner at her own small desk beside the board, because a working line meant a working operator whether or not the clock called it noon, and it was somewhere in the quiet stretch after 1 o'clock. With the winter sun coming thin and pale through the tall windows and lying in long bars across the floor, that Del Harmon's line finally dropped. "Number, please." A pause, the particular hesitating pause she had come to recognize instantly. "Afternoon, Grace. Might you ring me through to the Whitfield place?" "One moment." She found the jack, made the connection, and in the half-second before she withdrew her attention entirely, a professional half-second, brief and complete, she heard Iris Whitfield's voice come on the line bright with a pleasure she was clearly trying rather unsuccessfully to disguise as surprise, and Grace unplugged herself from the circuit with the small private warmth of a woman who has just done someone a kindness they will never quite know was a kindness, rather than simple machinery. Not long after, the toll line lit, a longer flap, set apart from the others, the one that meant a call reaching past the district entirely, and Grace plugged in to find a traveling notion salesman down at the hotel wanting the county seat, 12 miles off, a connection that could not be made direct but had to be passed hand to hand along the wire. County Exchange. "Please hold the line," she said, and rang the toll operator 2 towns over, a woman named Effie, whose voice Grace knew better by now than she knew the voices of half the people she passed on the street, though the two of them had met exactly once, at a district meeting the previous spring, and had spent most of it laughing together over precisely this fact. Grace, who's calling for who this time? A salesman for the county seat. Mr. Doyle, hotel guest, patient as they come so far. "Give me a moment. I've got 2 ahead of him." A pause, full of the faint hollow hum that always lived on a toll connection, a sound like wind heard from inside a jar. Then, ringing him through now, "Tell you, Mr. Doyle, he's a lucky man. The line's clear as a bell today." Grace relayed this, more or less, to the salesman waiting a patient in the hotel lobby, and within the minute had the small, larger satisfaction of a connection stretched not across a town, but across 3 separate exchanges and 2 operators' hands, holding true all the same, voice reaching man, reaching voice over 12 miles of cold wire and open winter country, as ordinary to her now as pouring a cup of coffee, though she never quite lost the private wonder of it either. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the floorboards as the hours went on. A farmer 3 miles out rang through wanting the feed store, his voice half lost under wind noise on his end of the line, and Grace had him repeat himself twice, patient as milk, until the connection held true. The minister rang the sexton about the hour for evening service. Old Mrs. Purcell, who could not hear well and always shouted a good deal more than the wire required, rang her daughter in the next town simply to be told at some length about the weather there, which was apparently much the same as the weather here, a fact that did not seem to trouble either of them in the slightest. By 4, the light outside had gone the particular flat gold of a winter afternoon nearly finished with itself, and Mr. Purdy's relief, a quiet young man named Otis, who took the evening shift 3 days a week, arrived a few minutes early and stood by the stove working the cold out of his hands before he'd even hung his coat. "Slow day?" "Steady," Grace said, which was what she always said, because there was no such thing, in her experience, as a day at the switchboard with nothing in it at all, only days where the small bridges came further apart. Mrs. Colby's on her 3rd call to her sister since breakfast, if you're keeping count. "I never keep count. It only encourages her." Grace laughed, gathered her things, and gave the board a final look before she rose. The long panel of quiet jacks, most of the little flaps sitting neat and white side down now, the room's whole quiet machinery waiting for whatever the evening would ask of it. The walk home took her past the lamplighter making his rounds along the square, the gas lamps catching one after another behind her as she went, and by the time she reached Mrs. Averill's front step, full dark had properly settled over Elm Street, cold and clear with a scatter of early stars showing above the rooftops. Supper was a quiet, companionable thing, the 2 of them at the small table with a stew Mrs. Averill had left simmering most of the afternoon, and afterward Grace helped clear the dishes before she settled at the little writing desk in the front room with a sheet of paper and the good pen, because Thursday was the evening she wrote to her mother, a habit kept faithfully enough now that her mother would have worried at its absence more than at any news it might contain. "Dear Mother," she wrote, and told her about the cold, and about Mrs. Colby's third call to her sister, and about Del Harmon, whom her mother had never met, but had come, over several months of letters, to take a proprietary interest in regardless, and about nothing very much else, because there was rarely very much else to tell, and Grace had come to understand that this was rather the point of a letter like this one. Not news, but the plain fact of a voice reaching across a distance, not unlike the very thing she spent her days arranging for other people, 40 feet or 40 miles at a time. She sealed it, set it by the door to post in the morning, and sat a while longer by the lamp with Mrs. Averill, who was working at a piece of mending with her spectacles pushed low on her nose, the two of them talking a little and then not talking at all, the fire settling in the grate, the whole house gone quiet and close around them, the way a house goes quiet only in the deep, cold months. "Bed," Mrs. Averill said eventually, folding her mending, the single word doing the whole work of a longer sentence between two people who had shared a roof this long. "Bed," Grace agreed. Her room upstairs was cold, as it always was this time of year, but the bed had been warmed with a flannel-wrapped brick an hour before, Mrs. Averill's quiet, unremarked kindness, and Grace undressed quickly in the near dark and slid beneath the quilts to find the warmth still holding faithfully at the foot of the bed. She lay a moment listening to the house settle for the night the way it settled every night, and thought, without any particular urgency, of tomorrow's board, the early calls, the Colby line, whatever small bridges the day would ask her to build between one house and the next. Somewhere down the street a dog barked twice and gave it up. The wind had eased since morning and only murmured now at the window glass instead of arguing with it. She thought, just before sleep took her properly, of the sound a connection made the instant it caught, that small definite click, two lines becoming one, and of how many of those small clicks she had made today and every day, one after another, joining voice to voice across a town that would otherwise have stayed a good deal more silent than it was. Her eyes closed. The house held its warmth around her, and somewhere out along the dark wires strung above Elm Street, the whole quiet exchange rested too, waiting, the way it always waited, for morning and the next small bridge to be built.